Hi, I want to talk about the distinction between idealism and materialism, and also just give a picture of how we form knowledge. Okay, for my epistemology, all we have is the stream of consciousness, the stream of perceptions, both real and unreal. And we're just receiving them all the time, and we're separating our perceptions into sense perceptions and nonsense perceptions, and we're just analyzing these perceptions to try to make sense of them. So consider, as a baby, we just look off into some image, and we see a bunch of color patterns: green, blue, brown, specular highlights, shading. You get all of these things. We start to notice, hey, these shapes all have a certain amount of similarity. These are stems, these are leaves. Some of these leaves are different, and the really different leaves are on different stems that go into a different part of the earth. And some of the perceptions, I'm by the road, some of the perceptions are, okay, look, those leaves look different from those other leaves, but they're on the same stem. Well, maybe those leaves have just, they don't have as much water, so they're still the same shape, but they're a different color. And we start to identify some of these things, okay, they're plants, and we abstract these forms: leaf, plant, stem. We abstract these forms. Eventually we have these forms, and we can use those forms then to recreate an image. We can draw a plant that's never existed before, for example. And most of us are not that great at drawing, so if we draw a plant, it really will be some generic plant idea. It won't be a plant from the real world. Now, the idealists are those that say that these forms, like the form of a plant or a leaf, are the essential truth of the matter, and that the leaves you see are just some kind of instance of that. And this is the Platonic idealism, where Plato thought that the reality was these forms, and that we were just seeing a bunch of imperfect copies of forms, and that the forms themselves had the greater reality. That these instances really come from the forms. My problem with that is that anything that comes from those forms, that painting or any idea, actually came originally from those perceptions. So the idealists are trying to pretend that their forms don't actually have to come from those perceptions. Even though they'll admit that they derive the form from the perceptions, they think they've discovered something more real. To me, anything that comes from those forms really came from our perceptions that we use to abstract those forms. Now, the materialist approach is a little bit different. Instead of breaking things down into more and more forms, there's a more tactile approach. It's more like when we see the leaf and there's sort of a form, we see the stems, those are sort of forms. We broke down materially the object into these parts, and they seem to still have forms. But the materialist approach is more like, instead of breaking down that leaf into what it looks like, let's actually go touch the leaf. Let's rip the leaf up. Let's tear it into smaller parts. We change the form, we change the shape of that material, but we're still saying, well, that's the same material that was in the leaf, so that's what's really in the leaf the whole time. As we break down this way, we start to break down leaves and stems into cells and chemicals. And we break things down this way. Now, the idealists have a sort of an unrepairable system, because they want to say that we can just look at these forms and work from there, whereas the forms came from the perceptions. The materialists in scientific empiricism are still basing everything on perception. So the materialism is much easier to repair into a skeptical epistemology, because I can define material in terms of perceptions, and everything works out. The idealists not so much so, because they're trying to say that the perceptions don't really count. The perceptions are just incidental. So a lot of materialists make a similar mistake. About the fundamentals of the particles, the smallest particles, the atoms, say that they've discovered. And they say, well, these things have an external existence separate from us. Okay, traditionally they say that. And that's the same error. That's the same error that the idealists are making. It's just that it's easier to take that error out and still have something called materialism than it is to take the error out of idealism and still have something you'd want to call idealism. So that's just an example of how these distinctions go from a bigger perspective, the epistemological perspective of what can we actually know. And so I've shown you the distinction, but I've also shown you how knowledge starts. That first we have a bunch of information, and then we sort the information. We get the abstractions later. Okay, what we have first is the extension. What we have first is a bunch of things we think are knowledge. We're trying to explain, well, what really defines that state? We have a bunch of things we think we know, and then we're trying to say, well, what do they really have in common? How can I really describe what they have in common? And that description will be a description of what it means for something to be knowledge. But we're starting off with just an extension, a set of things that we call knowledge, and then we look for an intentional definition of something that analytically would analytically correspond to that set. So, for example, I'm going to make a video again on spiritual, or on material spiritualism, material spirituality, and what people need to understand is what we have a bunch of experiences that we call spiritual. The intentional analytical interpretation of what those experiences are, due to a history of theism, has had a metaphysical flavor. We have to throw away that metaphysical flavor. Nothing is metaphysical. But we're still left with this set of experiences we call spiritual. And we still are left with the question of what do they have in common? Why do we think they have something in common? What is it about those experiences? Because we start off with just this image of all of these experiences that we believe are spiritual coming to us, and we're just sorting it out. Okay? And then, what does make those experiences in common? I'm interested in anybody who wants to tell me experiences they've had that they would consider spiritual. But to me, a spiritual experience ends up, what they have in common is that, one, I will have changed who I am. But not just changed, but changed in a way that expanded my perspective, to something greater. I've talked about watching butterflies fly really precise patterns, and it was a spiritual experience. One, I've noticed that many times, but I remember one day watching for a long time a bunch of butterflies in like a mating dance. And as I was watching, I was feeling this communion with nature. I was feeling this realization that the butterflies, when they're flying in their normal erratic-looking pattern, are not really flying erratically. That's intentional. They want to seem erratic. And it sort of expanded my view a little bit more. I understood something that seemed random as something ordered and rational. Something that seemed irrational, the way a butterfly flies, turned out to be rational. It's part of the butterfly's strategy. It's an intentional thing from the butterfly. And it expanded my point of view to something broader than it was. And so those are the kinds of experiences that are spiritual, those that are expanding our consciousness into a bigger picture. And as a result of that, I end up feeling humble in one sense, because it's like looking into the starry sky at night and feeling so insignificant. You feel insignificant, but you also feel connected. There's some connection there, some whole, some giant whole that you're a part of. And you have to be humble because you're such a small part, but you also end up feeling connected. And to me, that's what makes my spiritual experiences, what ties them together. And I don't know what it is for other people, but this is based a little bit on what other people describe as spiritual experiences too. And we can have this explanation. I can think of lots of reasons that we would biologically be evolved to grasp for these greater perspectives, at least as humans, and why that would be spiritual, and yet still entirely material. I mean, there's biochemical aspects that explain this. There's a lot of practical material things that would explain this phenomena. We shouldn't throw away an extension just because it turns out our intentional explanation of that extension was an error. To throw away an extension, we have to show that what we thought the group of things in that extension had in common, they don't really have in common. And that'll have to be it, because it's going to rain on me.